Hey, Hans here. Have you ever worked really hard for hours and hours and hours and felt like you're just spinning your wheels? Happens to me a bit more often than I'd like to admit. In fact, it happened last week. And I think what happened last week is a good highlight of what can go wrong and how to catch it. So what happened was I was working on ZitaFTP server, and I've already said I'm going to build the configuration user interface is going to be web-based, so through the web browser. And I ended up having to write my own HTTP server and mini framework because none of the C++ frameworks that I found out there were suitable for all the target platforms. Anyway, so I'm at the point where I need to implement a session ID. Now, the session ID is this random code that gets put in a cookie that JavaScript can't see for security reasons, and it gets sent with every request, and then the server can look up that ID in a database and say, oh yeah, this request is from that user. So I decided to look up what's the best way to generate the session ID, because it needs to be unguessable, basically. If it can be guessed, then somebody can potentially guess somebody else's session ID and hijack their session, which you definitely don't want. So I'm looking this up and I get told, hey, don't use session IDs, use JSON Web Tokens or JWT. They're way better. They have the information of everything you need for the request is in there. So the user's ID and any other details of what they're allowed to access is in there, and it's cryptographically signed. So that saves the server at least one database lookup, which is great for high traffic servers. And you can use them for single sign-on because you can use them on, you don't send it as a cookie, you use the authorized header, and you can then use it on multiple domains. And this sounded good initially. So I start researching them. I was like, what do you need? How do they work? Are there any C++ libraries that I can use? Yes, there are multiple ones. Which ones are good? Like how? Because when you start dealing with the cryptography and encryption and all that, things start getting more complicated, and there's more space for things to go wrong. And then I had this niggling feeling, but hey, wait a minute. If you're not sending it in a cookie, can't JavaScript see it? And doesn't that open you up to cross-site scripting attacks? So cross-site scripting attacks, or XSS, is when malicious JavaScript that's loaded in manages to get hold of your token, and it could send it to a malicious attacker who can then hijack your session and access everything that token allows, or session ID allows them to access, for as long as that token is valid. So we do a little bit more digging, and sure enough, XSS is a risk for these web tokens. And then I was like, okay, what should I do? And I kept looking at it and suddenly like, no, stop, wait a minute. ZitaFTP server is designed to be a private web server, so for individuals or families or businesses to use internally. I don't see it being used for a public high volume server anytime soon, although that may eventually come. Added to that, this little HTTP server is for the configuration user interface, and I don't see any reason why that would need to serve tens of thousands of users. So why am I looking at this more complex JWT? Yes, I could stick it in a cookie that JavaScript can't see, HTTP only cookie, but it's a lot bigger and you deal with the complexity of the cryptographic signature. What's the advantage? Especially for a server that's not going to be high volume. So I made that decision. No, let's go with the good old session ID. It's been battle tested since the 90s. It's worked very well. It's entirely appropriate, and it's a lot easier to do. And I managed to find the session ID or random session ID generation code actually in the code that handles securely storing the passwords, actually. So I guess the moral of the story is if you find yourself working away and researching and spinning your wheels, might be time to stop, just check yourself. It's like, what are the actual goals? Is what I'm doing right now really necessary? Is it really getting me closer to my goal? Or in this case, what happened with me is my desire to use the latest and greatest and get things perfect first time round got the better of me again. Fortunately, I caught myself before I wasted way more hours, which means I can now, let's see, the server should be running in the background, so if I refresh this, you should be able to see I have the beginnings of the configuration user interface. Here's the login screen. It's not fully wired up yet. You can enter in anything and it will tell you you got it wrong because I haven't written the code to pass the posted form, and I still need to write the code to generate a cross-site request forgery token to block out the CSRF attacks. It's a different kind of attack where you can get malicious, hijack somebody's session and get it to do something that they didn't specifically ask. So bit by bit, I'm getting there. I think that after writing all this low-level code, eventually you get to this point where writing one line of code starts to do more because you get to call these functions that do all this low-level stuff. And then things tend to speed up. I think I'm close to that point. So from here, creating the actual user interface should go a bit faster. Now, while on the one hand, I shouldn't have wasted this much time with the session ID, if you are writing a web app or a software as a service app, please, I'm begging you, take security seriously. Don't think you can do any old thing, slap anything together. I have heard of SaaS apps getting hacked. In one case, actually, the attacker managed to get enough permissions to be able to delete the database, and get this, they didn't have a backup. Now seriously, if you are writing a SaaS app for other people to use, take their data and their privacy seriously, and do put some effort into making sure that your system has a decent level of security. Right? There's always a way to crack them, but a decent level of security. You owe it to people who give you money or who trust you with their data to do that. Anyway, that's it for this week. Again, if this is helpful to you, I recommend subscribing. I'm currently trying to post a new video every week as I make progress. So until next time, see you later.